Alright, so in this video, we're going to be writing piecewise equations, functions from a graph. So in our first example here, we have three different lines, line 1, line 2, and line 3. So that means we're going to be writing three different subfunctions with three different domain restrictions. So let's start with our first one. Now, when we write our equations, preferably we should write these in point-slope form. So the two things we need again for point-slope form are a point and our slope. So let's say f of x is going to be equal to, we're going to write our first one here. So our point we're going to be using for this first one, let's go ahead and use this point right here, which will be negative 2, 2. And then our slope for this one, if we take that point and we take our slope, which looks like here, we're going up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 over 3. So if I go ahead and plug that into point slope form, I'll write that in the middle here. Our point slope form that we use is going to be y is equal to m times x minus x1 plus y1. So I just go ahead and plug those pieces of information in. So our slope we said was 5 over 3 times x minus our x1. Our x1 is negative 2, so minus negative 2 would actually result in a plus 2. And then plus y1, our y1 is 2, so plus 2. You can go ahead and leave it like this. That's perfectly fine. Also, it is perfectly fine that we use an open circle as our point, because we just have to make sure we remember how to properly address that when we write our domain restrictions. So I'm gonna do the domain restrictions after I write all the equations, and I'll move on after that. So that's the equation for our, at least that's our first subfunction there. Then we have our second one, which is a horizontal line. Our horizontal line is at y is equal to 1, 2, 3, 4. So when we have that, we just go ahead and write 4. Horizontal line, we just have our number there. And then lastly, our third subfunction, we have a point right here, and that point is at 3, 1. So using the same point slope form, we have my point. Then I'm going to go ahead and find out what my slope is. And this slope looks like it's a little difficult to find because it looks like if I went down 1, 2 and right 1, it doesn't always perfectly line up on our points. But for the sake of things, let's just go ahead and say that's going to be our slope here. So this is going to be negative 2 over 1, so my slope is going to be negative 2. So we will have negative 2 times x minus x1, so minus 3, plus y1, so plus 1. So that would be how I would use point slope form to write all three of my equations. And then after that, I have to do my domain restrictions. So that's going to be going where this graph, this subfunction, this piece of our function exists from. So for our first one here, we have an arrow going to the left, and then we have it stopping at x equals negative 2. At negative 2, we have an open circle here. So that means that my domain is going to be, you can write two different ways. I'll write it this way. Negative infinity is less than x is less than 2. You could also just go ahead and write x is less than 2. That would also work. Then we go ahead and look at our second one. So we have our y equals 4 section here. That starts at negative 2 with a closed circle. So we can go negative 2 is less than or equal to x. And then this one ends at positive 2. So is less than 2. I also realized I didn't put the negative sign there when I originally wrote that one for our first subfunction, but it stops at negative 2, so it should actually be a negative 2 there. And then lastly, for my last subfunction, this one starts at x equals 3. So I'll have 3 is less than or equal to x, and we have an arrow going to the right forever, so that is going to be less than infinity. And so that would be how we would write our absolute value function, not absolute value, our piecewise equation for our first graph here. Then let's go ahead and move on to our second graph. We're going to follow the same exact process here. We only have 2 lines, so that means we're going to be writing 2 equations or 2 subfunctions. So I'll call this one g of x, and that's going to be equal to, if I look at my first one, I'm going to use point slope form. So my point for this one is going to be at -2, 3. And my slope for this one is up 1 over 1. So it's going to be 1 over 1. So when I plug this back into my point slope form, I'll have 1 times x minus -2, because again, minus -2 would give us a +2. So that would actually be x plus 2. And then plus y1, so plus 3. And then this one right here is just like a horizontal line in our first example. That's at y equals -2. So that means we would just put -2 for our second subfunction. And then again, now we have to do our domains for it. So for our first one, we have an arrow to the left, which would be -infinity is less than x. And that's going to stop at 2 with an open circle. Not less than 2, less than -2. Stops at -2 with the open circle. And then for our final one here, we have it picking up right here, starting at -2. So -2 is less than or equal to x. And that's going to go on forever. So that is going to be less than infinity. And that would be how we would go ahead and write piecewise functions from a graph.